Look with me. I will introduce you to the message of God, the message of Moses, and then the statement that God makes through this young man, Caleb. Numbers 14 and 24, and you should see this on the slide. But my servant Caleb, he has a different spirit and has followed me fully. I will bring into the land which he entered, and his descendants shall take possession of it. This is God speaking here, and he is talking back and forth to Moses. And God tells Moses, listen, Caleb is going to cross over the Jordan into the promised land. And here's the reason why. He has a different spirit. And he followed me fully. Y'all ought to hold on to that. In Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 36 now, this is Moses speaking. And so Moses says, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, he shall see it. And to him and to his sons, I will give the land on which he has set foot, because he has followed the Lord fully. Moses said, I sent 10 spies or 12 spies over into Canaan. Only 2 of them came back with an accurate assessment of what was going on. Only 2 of them had the heart to trust God. Everybody else started sowing the spirit of fear and doubt, to the point they started a rebellion. Moses says only Caleb. In Joshua 14, 8 and 9, you will find these words. And this time, it's Caleb talking. So we've heard God talk about Caleb. We've heard Moses talk about Caleb. Let's hear what Caleb thinks. Joshua 14, 8 and 9 simply says, Caleb makes the statement, nevertheless, my brethren, who went up with me, made the heart of the people melt with fear. But I followed the Lord my God fully. So Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot is trodden will be an inheritance to you and your children forever, because you have followed the Lord my God fully. And I want to talk about 2 out of 2 million. See, I believe that salvation comes by faith through grace. You put your faith in the finished work of Jesus Christ and no one else. But if all you want, all you can see is the fact that, man, my sins are paid for, I'm going to heaven, I'm going to sit down, rest, and take it easy, you missed it. We live in a broken world, demonically filled with spirits that are working actively against the children of God, the children of men, to keep their eyes blinded and their souls locked. And if you don't recognize you have been in a battle ever since the first breath you took when you left your mother's womb, shame on you. Here's a challenge today. God made promises. He called Abram out of his father's house, a home, a family, and a community of idolaters. They were sinners. But God, out of grace and mercy, called Abram out, and through him, he wants to build a family. Told Abram, I'm not only going to build a family, I'm going to build a nation out of you. Then he told him, I'm going to make your seed, your descendants, as many as the stars in the heavens or the sands on the seashore. That's a lot of babies. That's a big family. But when that family leaves Egypt and gets to the Jordan River and they stop, only 2 men over the age of 20 crossed over into that Canaan land. Why is that? Why is that? So here's my premise. God makes the promise of an inheritance, but it comes with conditions. There's a difference between an inheritance of saying, I have the land promised to me, and there's a big difference between just simply living there. You need to hear me today. You need to hear me. There's a difference, Jim, when you own something versus just inheriting something. If you inherit it and you accept it, you own it. The contrast is you can live someplace, But if you don't own it, all you do is reside there. You're paying rent. Some of y'all found out when you're renting, you don't build equity. Somebody else does. Somebody else builds equity. Somebody else is growing wealth. Israel as a nation was promised the land of Canaan, and some conditions came along with it. Let me just quickly show you a couple. You'll find in the Old Testament in Genesis 17 that when God calls Abram out of his family and life of idolatry, he calls him into a covenant relationship, and he tells Abraham, listen, I need you to circumcise yourself. Tells him the sign of your commitment and your connection with me and what distinguishes you from the world is circumcision. He tells him. And every one of your male children that are born to you after the age of 8 needs to be circumcised. And that is the covenant. Abraham could have said, yeah, no. And the promise of the land would have been forfeited. He doesn't. He acts on it. He lets everybody know in his tribe and in his group, this is what God has called for us to do. They continue this covenant responsibility right up until they get into Egypt. And when they're in Egypt and they're there for over 400 years and they end up enslaved there, there's another example of understanding the covenant relationship. One day, God calls Moses out of the wilderness to come back into Egypt and to tell Pharaoh, these are my people here, let them go. And finally, on the 10th plague, Moses tells the Hebrews now, listen, take a lamb, a male lamb, a lamb without spot or wrinkle, and you sacrifice it, but capture the blood, take the blood and mark it on the side of the doorpost and across the top mantle. Because tonight the angel of the Lord is going to pass through Egypt, and the firstborn of every family, every firstborn son is going to pass away. They do exactly as they are instructed. And the Hebrews survive the slaying of the firstborn. There's a covenant in place. But here's how the Old Testament works. God calls Abraham to a relationship to himself, and it is always based on faith. Abraham believes the word of God, and then there is a demonstration about the integrity of his faith because he's required to do something. And in the faith comes an act of obedience. For the larger group, once they leave Egypt, here's the bigger deal. Everybody lives by faith. Every one of them are called to obey. But here's the responsibility when they get to the Jordan that God requires of them. Listen, I need you to cross over, go into Canaan, and join the battle with me. The 12 spies come back. Only 2 of them say, we can do this. The rest of them say, listen, there's giants over there. They're big, they're strong, they're armed. We can't fight these people. They are too much for us. Part of the condition of entering into the inheritance of the land is that you have to join the battle. Faith is required, obedience is required, and if God is going to war on your behalf, you join him. You go in and clear out the Canaanites out of the land. I'll fight with you, but we fight together. Some of you ought to hear me today because there are challenges in your life. You're looking to somebody else to fix it. There are obstacles in your life, and you can't figure out how to get over them. There are things in your life that are strongholds, that'll hold you down, that'll set you back, that will keep you on lockdown. And God is saying, join me in the battle. Follow me, completely submit to me, trust me, have your faith, have it become visible and real in your commitment. He's not interested in my excuses or my fears, just my full and total trust. Remember, he said of Caleb, he's got a different spirit. He's got a willingness to trust me no matter what it looks like, no matter what it seems like, how great the odds. And when you read Joshua there with me in chapter 14, verses 8 and 9, do you know where Caleb was at in his life? Caleb said, listen, I'm an old man now. I'm in my 80s. And I'll take the ground up on the high ground. And I will go and I will fight the enemy that exists there, because I'm as strong today as I was in my 20s. And I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. He had a different spirit, a different mind, a different outlook on his experience with God. In him, as long as God is with him, I can do anything. I'm asking you to stretch today. I'm asking you to stretch. You'll see this on the slide, 1 Corinthians 10:6. The issue of the Hebrews is documented in the New Testament, especially with the wilderness generation that died in the wilderness. It's documented for you and I. Paul said these things happen as examples for us so that we would not crave evil things as they also craved. God wanted us to know what happened to an entire generation of millions of people, millions of God's, are you with me? God's people. I'm saying to you, those people had entered into the Abrahamic covenant and were circumcised, the men. Those people, those Hebrews, took the blood and they marked it on the post. They marked it on the header, and they were telling, I am God's child, and I'm following his directives. His people, over 2 million of them, died in the wilderness. I need you to hear me today. I'm suggesting to you inheritance is one thing. Heaven is another. Somebody look up at me and say, what'd you say? Inheritance is one thing. Heaven is another. And just you getting to heaven is not all that God offers and not all that God has. And if all you settling for is just getting by right now, you missed it. Don't sell God. Don't sell yourself short. An inheritance does not carry the same weight and is not equivalent to heaven. But I say to you, those believers who faithfully, who consistently obey God, not only have heaven to look forward to, but so much more. And I'm going to share with you an aspect of that this morning. So, Old Testament believers were offered an inheritance. The inheritance was the land of Canaan, an earthly inheritance. That earthly inheritance came with conditions, faith, obedience, and joining God in the fight to clear out Canaan. That generation forfeited their earthly inheritance because of disobedience, the fear of joining the fight. It was the fear of joining the fight. However, loss of inheritance doesn't mean a loss of salvation. If you don't know God like the Bible describes God, you've really been selling yourself short. The loss of the inheritance does not mean a loss of heaven. It is the forfeiture of rewards. When Jesus goes to the cross and says it's finished and hangs his head and dies, and those that put their faith in him, they have had their sins dealt with in the redemptive work of Christ, and heaven and salvation is secure. But if you don't recognize what motivated Peter and James and John and Mary and Martha and all of those people who had this personal experience with Jesus, if you don't understand what motivated them to leave their families, leave their jobs, to separate from the things of the world because of the call of God to share the gospel with everybody, then I'm worried. I'm worried about what type of faith you have. And if you sold out for less than what God is offering, I pray that's not the case. Look with me back in Genesis 15. There are two types of inheritance that I told you, and I'm going to share the Old Testament inheritance with you. Genesis 15:7 simply reads, and he said to them, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. God is saying, I called you, Abram. You didn't call me. You didn't come looking for me. I found you right where you were at. I found you in the land of Ur, of the Chaldeans, and then I wanted to give you a land separate from your pop's land, your mom's land, your family land. I'm going to give you a land for yourself. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this for you. Two types of inheritances. Every Hebrew who followed the path that Abram laid had a spiritual inheritance with God. Every Hebrew who entered into this covenant with God by faith had the promise of an inheritance. First inheritance issue, do you have God? They entered into a covenant relationship with God, and every member of the family of the nation followed this same process from one to the next, to the next, to the next. God was the first level of inheritance. You had with them a spiritual inheritance, which was God. Second level of inheritance was the promise of a physical land that God called and gave to them himself. You want to know the truth? Not every one of them inherited the land. Do you know that Abraham did not enter the land and stay there to occupy it? No. Do you know that Moses was on the opposite side of the Jordan, and it was Joshua and Caleb that crossed over the river? Moses didn't go. 2 million plus souls who were in covenant relationship with God stayed on the opposite side of the river. They never went into the land. As the children of Israel, as a child of Abraham, they were heirs of God, heirs of the land of Canaan, but all of that was by virtue of faith, obedience, and in the context of the wilderness generation, it had everything to do with joining the battle, getting in the fight, not being afraid, trusting God to do what only God can do. Only two that go through. And God said it was because, speaking of Caleb in particularly, he had a different spirit. He fully obeyed me. He fully did it. In the New Testament, I want you to see the parallel. Romans 8:17 puts it like this. This is the New Testament idea of inheritance. And if children, heirs, also heirs of God and fellow heirs with Christ, if indeed we suffer with him, so that we may be also glorified with him. Two types of inheritance. Every person who's put their faith in Jesus Christ is just like the Old Testament saints. You're an heir of God. He is your father. You are his daughter, his son. We have a relationship as heirs of God. Paul says that not only that, not only children and heirs of God, but he calls it fellow heirs, or what we call joint heirs of Christ. When I say to you last week that in Hebrews 3:14, God calls you champions, it's because you and I have joined the fight. We are heirs of God by faith, but we are also joint heirs with Christ. And in that context, God was requiring, God was desiring for every believer to rule with him. Genesis 1 talks about God made Adam in his own image, and the plan was for Adam and Eve to rule with him. You're just trying to make it every day, right? You're just trying to get through till tomorrow. I'm asking you to start breaking different ground. I'm asking you to see time and eternity in different lights. Time is temporary. Eternal is eternal. And what God has in store for you is about the eternal. And when you hit there, you don't want to just go in the back door of heaven. You want to walk through the gates. You want to hear Jesus say, well done, good and faithful servant, well done, because that's the call to come, to join, rule with me. He is raising up kings and queens, servants, to rule with him in the millennial kingdom. Why would you settle for less? It's not enough just to get to heaven. Paul is simply saying in Romans 8:17, perseverance is the issue about the people of God. In the Old Testament, you had to be able to have the confidence to march over a swollen up river just like you did the sea, the Red Sea. How do you cross a sea that is deep and is daunting? You don't unless God does something phenomenal. How do you cross a swollen river if God doesn't stop it and block it up? And you can walk over, not just in mud up to your thighs, but walk across on dry ground. Doesn't happen unless God's involved. How can you fight giants without God's help? But the issue is, join the fight. Join the fight. So here's a thought. I'm going to read this back to you in Genesis 15. Did Abraham's obedience, listen, merit God's promise? Was his faith simply just works? What was it that made God do what he did? Genesis 15:5 simply says, and he took him outside and says, now look toward the heavens, count the stars. And if you're able to count them, and he said to him, so shall be your descendants. Abraham hadn't done a thing except believe. He blessed him with the call. He promised him the inheritance and the descendants. But Abraham technically yet hadn't done a thing. So I'm asking, where are you at in your faith? Don't get discouraged either. Don't say, Pastor, well, I haven't been called to missions, or Pastor, I haven't been called to preacher. Pastor, I'm not gifted or talented as a teacher. I'm not talking about gifts right now. I'm talking about relationship. You've been called by God. You've put your faith in Jesus Christ. He's washed away your sins and forgiven them all. Where are you at in your faith? Where are you at? Because we know for a fact that Abraham went right out after Genesis 15, took his son, the promised son that God was giving to him as a beginning for his descendants, and marched him up a hill, put him on a sacrificial altar, took out a knife, and was prepared to take his life. And God stopped him and said, I know your heart. I know you will obey me, and you will fully follow me. And stopped him in that process. What boundaries have you placed on your faith? What barriers have you allowed to be set up you won't cross that are hindering your spiritual growth? Pray for you today. In Genesis 22:18, he said, in your seed all the nations of the earth shall be blessed because you have obeyed my voice. He tells Abraham, I saw your faith today. Your actions demonstrated your heart and your character. But he offers Abraham a reward of millions and millions of descendants before he ever demonstrates his faith in obedience. So what was it that God did? It was an act of mercy. You and I have been the benefactors of the mercy of God our entire spiritual life because he saw in us what we and no one else saw. He did for us what we could not do for ourselves. And I'm not here today because it's Sunday. I'm not here today because it's tradition. I'm here today because of the relationship God made with me in Christ Jesus and the faith that I've placed in him and what he's done for me. And so, quite frankly, I've made a choice. I'm going to lay down my life, Benjamin. I'm going to lay it down. There's no area I won't yield. There's no ground I won't surrender. There's no barrier I won't cross. I'm committed to building the kingdom both in my life and the lives of others. I'm willing to take the challenge of whatever God is calling for in my life. You know why? Because that's what he's after. All of me. Don't give God just Sunday. Don't give him a corner. Don't give him a portion. Give him all of you. Let me go to my final premise. Here's where I'm at. In the discussion this morning, here's my major premise when it comes to the idea of 2 out of 2 million in relationship to the inherited promise that God made. The promise is Canaan. Canaan was the inheritance. Promised them land. The minor premise, the land is to be attained, but it's by condition. It takes faith. It takes obedience. So I'm speaking to those people who feel like, well, Pastor, if you're telling people that they can get saved and they can get saved by grace through faith, well, what about all the other stuff they're responsible for doing? See, this has never been a license to sin. It's never been a thing with Christianity where you can just do whatever you want to do and call it good and you're going to get in the back door. No, I think you're going to walk up and you're going to get called up and you're going to stand before the judgment seat of Christ and never say a word. You won't be able to tell him the excuses you've conjectured in your own minds in the here and now. You won't be able to. You won't be able to. The minor premise is the land is to be obtained by the condition of faith and obedience. What's the conclusion then, Pastor? The inheritance is obtained by the condition of faith and obedience. Old Testament, New Testament. It's faith in the finished work of Christ. And the work of Christ that begins in faith will transform your life. And so your life is laid down just as sure as Jesus laid his down. As sure as his life got up, you're going to get up into a newness of life. And I don't care how many times you fall. Keep getting up. I don't care how difficult it gets. Persevere. I don't care what people say. I don't care how many of your friends tell you, you can't do this. You ain't going to be able to do that. You won't be able to accomplish this. You can tell them straight out, they're a lie. If Christ in me, I can do all things. And even though today wasn't a good day, tomorrow is promised, and I'm still going to get up. I'm going to trust him for whatever I need because he has given to me the ability to serve him. Doesn't matter what big or what height or what strength or volume of power in the opponents. I'm fighting with God. God's fighting with me. He turned me loose on earth where Satan lives. And he never left me alone. He never deserted me. He's here to stand by you. He will empower you. He will strengthen you. And one day he's going to say, well done. You are the metahos. You are the champions of God. You are the men and the women that I've called out of this world to lead and to rule with me.